Hi, I'm Nathan, artist at Emergent, and in this video we're going to cover rigging for Gamebryo in Maya. Now, you've probably already guessed that I'm not going to rig this character from scratch in this video, as that would take way too long to set everything up, and you can see that I've already got him rigged here. Instead, I'm going to cover some of the topics that you need to keep in mind and be aware of as you're rigging your character for Gamebryo to make sure everything gets exported correctly. So, sort of the root of everything as you're setting up your character for export is the actual character root. You want to make sure, after you've built your rig and got everything skinned, that you have all of the in-game components for your character located under a single node in your scene. So in this case, I've got all the character geometry, which consists of 3 different meshes: the face, the hair, and the body. He's got a dynamic texture effect, that environment map that we applied back in an earlier video, and then all of the bones that he's actually rigged to, all under this single node. This is the character's skeleton here. And you're going to define this node as your character root, and you do that if you go up here to your toolbar and click on Create Character Sequence, the little blue and green biped man there. If you've got your character root selected in your scene, you can hit Add Selected. It's going to prompt you for a sequence name just because it has to create a sequence for every layer. So we're just going to call this Idle. And that will go ahead and define this node as your character root. Now, something else to be aware of that Gamebryo is capable of is animation layers. Now what this does, right now if I start defining animation sequences, they're going to affect every bone in the entire character and the materials and meshes. So if I have any shape animation on these meshes, and that'll go under this sequence. If I do any animations on the materials, all of that will wind up in this sequence. But if I want to have sequences that only affect a part of the character, so say I want to do animations on the character's material that happen regardless of what pose he's in, I can define these meshes as their own animation layers. Or if I want to have animations that just affect, say, the character's face or the character's hands, I can define an animation layer and only store sequence data for that part of it. And the way you do that is by setting up the hierarchy in such a way to take advantage of that. So if I wanted to animate just the character's face, let me go ahead and make that selectable. I can select the character's neck, hit Add Selected under here. Let me go ahead and add a sequence for that. And now the character's neck is the root of its own animation layer. So anything below the neck in the hierarchy will be affected by any animation sequences I define here. Now you may find there's situations where you want to have an animation layer, but there's not a good bone to select to affect that. So for example, if I wanted to make both of his arms a single animation layer, but I didn't want the character's head to be a part of that for whatever reason. As it exists right now, that's going to be kind of difficult to do. I can select the chest, which includes both arms, but it also has a lot of other bones that I might not want as a part of that layer. And also you can see I still have the character's head. But you have to do this by selecting a single bone. So I can't just select, the root of both of these and define that as a layer root. It's only going to create a layer root for one of them. So one way you can work around this limitation is by divorcing your character's in-game skeleton from the skeleton that you use to animate on. And what I mean by that is, so these are the bones I've decided I want in the game, but I also have a duplicate skeleton that I've created, let me unhide it here, that I'm actually animating on. And all of the bones in the in-game skeleton, as you can see over here, are parent constrained to their corresponding bones in the animation rig. And what that lets me do is I can reorder, reorient, add new bones, create new constraints on the in-game rig as I need, without messing up how those are going to be animated. So if I wanted to have both of his arms in a single animation layer, I could create a new bone that's below the chest in the hierarchy, and inherit both arms from that, and then use a parent constraint to set that up. And I could define that as the animation layer root for that, but it's not actually adding anything to it. It exists in the scene just to act as an animation root. But because the neck is still inheriting from the chest, then the head wouldn't be a part of that. So it's one of the options you can use. One of the other advantages of making a double skeleton is that, well, again, it'll let you reorient anything because it's going to grab translation information for any of these bones. So in other engines, when you export character animation, specifically with bones, it might just write out rotation data for those bones. Gamebryo is going to write out translation and rotation data and scale. However, as you're probably already aware, Gamebryo is only capable of uniform scale. You can't do non-uniform scale. So the double skeleton also lets you work around that, especially if you need to set up, say, a squash stretch rig, if you have limbs that need to stretch, or in the case of this character, you can see he's got these hoses on his arms here, and I need those to stretch as he moves his arm forward. Let me demonstrate here. those actually have to stretch. And the way I've accomplished that is I have the bones in the animation rig, those each scale along just their x-axis. And then the bones in the game rig are parent constrained to those, so their scale never changes, but they stay in the right place. So using this double skeleton will also let you achieve that. Some of the other things to be aware of as you're creating your in-game skeletal hierarchy is how you need to set that up for bone and skin LOD or ragdoll. Bone and skin LOD, like animation layers, is very dependent on your hierarchy. When you're defining your bone LODs, anytime you define a new bone LOD, you can tell it new bones that you want to be treated as leaf nodes. So for example, if I want to cut out all of the character's fingers as this guy moves farther away, I can select his wrist and say that's a new leaf node for the next bone LOD. And it's going to keep his wrist and delete all of the bones past that, so all of his fingers will get deleted in that LOD. But again, you have to do this one bone at a time. So let's say I wanted to cut out, he's got these shoulder pads here. If I wanted to cut out the bones for those in their own LOD, right now the only bone that they share in common is the chest bone, so I could define that as a leaf node, but then it's going to delete all the bones lower than that in the hierarchy, which you can tell I'd be losing a lot of bones that I really want to keep. The only other option I'd have as this exists right now is to select the root of each of those and say those are now leaf nodes. But in that case, it's going to keep these two bones and delete the ones past them. So another thing I could do is create another bone in his hierarchy, parent both of these shoulder blades to that new bone, and make sure everything else inherits from the chest. And then I could set up parent constraints to make sure that that bone always stays in the right position. And that would let you achieve that. So something else to be aware of as you're setting up your hierarchy, if there's bones that you explicitly want to cull out as your character moves farther away, you need to make sure that they're easily selectable, in your hierarchy, and that you're not going to lose any other bones that you actually want to keep. Also, if you're planning to set up your character for ragdoll, one of the things you need to be aware of is that you can't skip bones in the hierarchy as you're setting up your ragdoll chains. So if I was going to ragdoll this character's leg, obviously I would need a physics volume at the root of the character, and I would need one at the knee. But if I didn't create one at the hip, it's going to make that ragdoll very unstable. So if there's bones that you know that you don't need ragdoll volumes for, make sure that there's also no bones lower than them in the hierarchy that you will need physics volumes for, because if you skip that bone, you're going to end up with some instability. So those are the things you need to be aware of as you're setting up your in-game hierarchy for your skeleton. Make sure you can select things and call them out in a convenient fashion. Once you've got that all set up, though, and you've created your animation controls, chances are, regardless of how you set up, you're going to have quite a few animation controls, and none of these actually need to go into the running game. It's just going to be extra data that's taking up space that you don't want to export. So the way you can get around that is if you put all of your control objects in a single group. You can see I've got these all in one group here. If you go into your attribute editor and hit add attributes, you're going to create a new string attribute and call it ni data, capital N, capital D, underscore, and you can name it whatever you want after that. So I'm just going to call this extra data, hit OK. And in the field for this, if you add the flag ni remove object, that's going to flag this object to be deleted on export. The way to make sure this actually gets picked up, and you're going to go over here to your export options. Let me pull this up so you can see it. You go to update export scripts, and if you look at this list here, you're looking for remove tagged objects plugin. If that doesn't exist, it's going to ignore that. If it's not there, you can click on your script editor, and you can find that in the list here. Select it and add it, and you want to make sure that that runs before NIF exporter or controller extractor. You can put it anywhere else, but if it runs after those two things, it will have already written the file by the time it actually runs this plugin. So if that exists in your script and you have this flag on your object, when you actually go to export this, it will delete that node and anything below it. So in this case, we're going to get just our in-game character node, and it'll delete all of our control objects from the final game asset. So the last few things that you need to be aware of as you're setting up your character. If you go into scene graph optimization, this exists in just about any script you can find. Go to edit plugin. There's a little section over here for skin and bones support. As you're rigging your character, you want to keep track of how many bones you're using, obviously because it's going to affect performance, but every time you go over 30 bones, it's going to break up any mesh that's attached to that so that no part of the mesh is affected by more than 30